Good day, I'm Irish Maybe Sernal, and I will be discussing first the role and growth of remittances. So before I get started with my discussion, let's watch first the animated video that I will be presenting to know more about remittances.
For 5 years now, Anita is living in France. Like 200 million people worldwide, she transfers money to her relatives, back in the country where she was born. For her parents, who live in Haiti, Anita's remittances are the main source of income. Why are remittances so important? According to the World Bank, more than $595 billion have been transferred by migrants to their countries of origin in 2017. That's 3 times larger than the official development assistance. About 800 million people are supported by that money. Remittances typically account for about 60% of the recipient's income. The money from Anita is used by her parents to pay immediate basic needs. So, remittances play an essential role in the survival of families in developing countries and contribute to the reduction of poverty. How does it work? For the transfer of money to her parents, Anita uses the services of banks or other providers, like RIA, or Western Union. But all of them charge fees for their services. An example, when Anita transfers $200, it costs her at least $15. Regarding the enormous aid and relief such remittances provide, that's too expensive. Especially after natural disasters like the earthquake in Haiti 2010, as Anita's parents were deeply in need of the money. Moreover, Anita's parents either need to have a bank account, go to an ATM, or an RIA shop, which might not be around the corner to finally receive the money and pay with it. That's time-consuming. So, what needs to be done? The United Nations Agenda 2030 aims among other things at reducing global inequality. The 10th Sustainable Development Goal includes the objective to reduce the costs of remittances to 3% worldwide. At a 3% fee, Anita would only have to pay $6 to send her $200. That's $9 less than before. How to do this? To achieve this goal, a modernization of the remittances market is needed. New technological solutions to remit money must be implemented. For instance, instead of sending money via bank transfer, Anita could use the mobile phone, which charges fewer fees. But currently, there is no provider who's offering that service for Anita. To support new technologies for remitting money, we need a better collaboration between politicians, banks, service providers and civil society. The high costs for remittances hamper their developmental impact. Therefore, remittances must become cheaper and faster to enlarge their contribution to reduce poverty. Otherwise, migrants will choose other insecure channels to transfer money to relatives in their country of origin, thereby being exposed to the risk that all the money gets lost. Let's work together on making remittances cheaper and faster, thereby more attractive and safer, so that people like Anita can support their relatives more easily.
So the video talks about how remittances work and what its essential role, especially in the survival of the families in developing countries. Wage levels in the high-income economies are approximately 5 times the level of wages for employment and similar occupation in the developing nations on average, after adjusting for purchasing power parity. And this provides an obvious incentive for migration, and indeed, hopeful migrants often take great personal risk to make the journey to the United States, Europe, and even developing country destinations. In part because of these incentives, by 2010, there were an estimated 200 million migrants worldwide. But about half of all migrants leave a developing nation move to other developing nations. So, there are legitimate concerns that outmigration can hamper development prospects because of the loss of skilled workers via this brain drain. So, what is brain drain? Brain drain is a slang term that alludes to the loss of human capital from one area to another, or from one industry to another. Brain drain usually happens when skilled individuals and professionals leave the home countries, in most cases developing nations, and go elsewhere to take advantage of better opportunities. Balancing this concern is the benefit through remittances to relatives in migrants' countries of origin, beyond the gains to the successful, legal or illegal migrants themselves. When migrants are low-skilled and the recipients of remittances are poor, the potential development and poverty reduction advantages become clear. Why remittances provide a significant pathway out of poverty? So it is because migrants often build houses for their families and send money that is vital for keeping children in school and better fed. Thus, remittances now provide a significant pathway out of poverty. As we watched in the animated video, remittances are important because they allow migrant workers to transfer money to their families in order to meet their needs and lift them out of poverty. Indeed, the World Bank reports that based on household surveys, remittances have substantially reduced poverty in such countries as Guatemala, Uganda, Ghana, and Bangladesh. This figure shows various resource flows to developing countries over the period 1990 to 2008. Percent of GDP of low-income countries outpacing FDI and approaching inflows from aid. However, remittance flows are very uneven across developing countries. This figure is the latest data that I've gathered from United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, which shows the importance of external financing flows to least developed countries, landlocked developing country, and small island developing states. The three sources combined on occasion amount to 15% or more of total GNI. Though in recent years, this share has been decreasing, driven mostly by slowdowns in FDI or ODA, the latter of which increased significantly in 2020. In fact, although a sizable source of financial flows, FDI shows high volatility, in addition to a downward trend since 2008 for LLDCs and SIDS. Remittances for all three groups routinely account for more than 4% of GNI, and they are significant both in terms of high volume and low volatility. Remittances represent a more stable inflow than FDI, with a standard deviation almost 10 times lower over the period covered. Table 14.1 lists the top 15 remittance recipient countries, ranked by dollars and by share of GDP in 2008. India and China had the largest remittances, but Mexico was in a third place. And as the table shows, in 15 countries, remittances represented at least 11% of GDP. Note, however, that in the wake of the financial crisis, remittances declined in all regions from 2008 into 2010 except in South Asia, where they remain stable. This figure is the latest data that I've gathered also from United Nations Conference on Trade and Development. Countries receiving the highest remittances in 2022. For the past 15 years, India has consistently topped the chart of the largest remittance beneficiaries, with an estimated $100 billion in remittances received. India is said to have reached an all-time high in 2022. This increasing flow of remittances can be partially attributed to migrant Indians switching to high-skilled jobs in high-income countries, including the US, the UK, and Singapore, from low-skilled and low-paying jobs in Gulf countries. Mexico and China round out the top three remittance-receiving nations, with estimated inbound transfer of $60 billion and $51 billion, respectively, in 2022. And of course, our country, which in the fourth place. The growth of recorded remittances is due in part to improved accounting. Some analysts view even the statistics of recent years to be subject to considerable undercounting, but other important factors include the rising number of migrants and advances in financial intermediation that reduce the cost to migrants of remitting funds to their families. Thus, the rapid rise in remittances is a genuine phenomenon. It is important to stress, however, that migration is not always voluntary and may result from human trafficking, even when departure is voluntary. It is often done with imperfect information about working conditions, and exploitation and abuse are not uncommon. Clearly, for migration to bring the maximum social benefit to people in developing countries, improve regulations and protections for what the International Labor Organization terms irregular status migrants and the working conditions of migrants will be essential, as will improve willingness of developed countries to accept reasonable increase in migration. Next topic that I will be discussing is about foreign aid, the development assistance debate. So let's define first what is foreign aid. It is the international transfer of public funds in the form of loans or grants, either directly from one government to another, or indirectly through the vehicle of a multilateral assistance agency such as the World Bank. In simple terms, foreign aid is anything that one country gives for the benefit of another country. Usually, this means higher income countries providing development assistance to lower and middle income countries. To know more about foreign aid, let's watch together the animated video that I will be presenting.
U.S. foreign assistance helps people affected by natural disasters by providing shelter, water, and food. In struggling communities, girls have access to education, women can safely deliver their babies in clinics, and farmers have seeds to grow their own crops. But how much does it all cost? Surveys have shown that many Americans think that 28% of their tax dollars goes to foreign assistance, but in reality, it's only 1%, and only about half of that goes to fight poverty. It's hard to imagine what that 0.5% must look like. But that same 0.5%, used the right way, can move mountains. If you plant 0.5% of an ear of corn, those 4 kernels can grow to feed an entire village. That 0.5% can go on to save millions of lives. Still, that 0.5% is not enough. What if Americans knew how much change was happening with only 0.5% and acted to help that 0.5% grow? Those 4 kernels could allow a farmer to employ more farmers. Those farmers can then begin trading with other villages to help build self-sufficient communities. Imagine how many people's lives can be made better, how many mouths can be fed, how many children can be saved. You don't have to imagine it. Here's the truth. Each year, more than 100 million children receive basic immunizations, and every additional year of secondary schooling allows a girl the ability to boost her income by as much as 25%, marry later, and invest in her community. Millions of people, a majority of them women, have greater opportunities for generating income and creating greater financial stability. By voicing our support for U.S. foreign assistance, organizations like CARE can give more families and more communities the tools they need to lift themselves out of poverty. And that's good for all of us, because safer, more stable, and more prosperous developing countries create a better, safer world for everyone. Please join CARE's effort to deliver lasting change by supporting increased U.S. foreign assistance. Empowering people has lasting effects. Together, we can make sure that no one goes to bed hungry.
In addition to export earnings and private foreign direct and portfolio investment, developing countries receive 2 other major sources of foreign exchange. It is the public or official bilateral and multilateral development assistance and private or unofficial assistance provided by non-governmental organizations or NGOs. Both of these activities are forms of foreign aid, although only public aid is usually measured in official statistics. In principle, all governmental resource transfer from one country to another should be included in the definition of foreign aid. Even the simple definition, however, raises a number of problems. For one thing, many resource transfer can take disguised forms such as the granting of preferential tariffs by developed countries to exports of manufactured goods, particularly particular. This permits developing countries to earn more foreign exchange from selling their industrial products in developed countries. Markets at higher prices than would otherwise be possible. There is consequently a net gain for developing countries and a net loss for developed countries, which amounts to a real resource transfer to the developing world. Such implicit capital transfer or disguise flow should be counted in qualifying foreign aid flows. Normally, however, they are not. However, we should not include all transfer of capital to developing countries, particularly the capital flows of private foreign investors. But why? It is because private flows represent normal commercial transactions prompted by commercial considerations of profits and rates of return, and therefore should not be viewed as foreign aid. Commercial flows of private capital are not a form of foreign assistance, even though they may benefit the developing country in which they take place. Economists have defined foreign aid, therefore, as any flow of capital to a developing country that meets two criteria. First, its objective should be non-commercial from the point of view of the donor, and second, it should be characterized by concessional terms. That is, the interest rate and repayment period per borrowed capital should be softer or less stringent than commercial terms. So what is concessional terms? It is defined as the terms for the extension of credit that are more favorable to the borrower than those available through standard financial markets. Just as there are conceptual problems associated with the definition of foreign aid, there are measurement and conceptual problems in the calculation of actual development assistance flows. In particular, three major problems arise in measuring aid. First is we cannot simply add up the dollar values of grants and loans. Each has a different significance to both donor and recipient countries. Loans must be repaid and therefore cost the donor and benefit the recipient less than the nominal value of the loan itself. Conceptually, we should deflate or discount the dollar value of interest-bearing loans before adding them to the value of outright grants. Second, aid can be tied either by source or by project. In either case, the real value of the aid is reduced because the specified source is likely to be an expensive supplier or the project is not of the highest priority. Furthermore, aid may be tied up to the importation of capital-intensive equipment, which may impose an additional real resource cost in the form of higher unemployment on the recipient nation, or the project itself may require the purchase of new machinery and equipment from monopolistic suppliers while existing productive equipment in the same industry is being operated at very low levels of capacity. Finally, we always need to distinguish between the nominal and real value of foreign assistance. Aid flows are usually calculated at nominal levels and tend to show a steady rise over time. However, when deflated for rising prices, the actual real volume of aid from most donor countries has declined substantially in recent decades despite a recent uptick. So the next subtopic is the amounts and allocation, public aid. Official Development Assistance or ODA, it is a net disbursements of loans or grants made on concessional terms by official agencies, historically by high-income member countries of the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development or OECD. In simple, it is defined as a government aid that specifically targets the economic development and welfare of developing countries. The money volume of official development assistance, which includes bilateral grants, concessional loans, and technical assistance, as well as multilateral flows, grew from an annual rate of under $5 billion in 1960 to $50 billion in 2000 and to over $128 billion in 2008. However, the percentage of developed country gross national income allocated to official development assistance declined from 0.51% in 1960 to 0.23% in 2002, before improving to 0.33% by 2005 and to 0.45% in 2008. As part of a campaign to increase assistance in the wake of the continued lag in human development in sub-Saharan Africa, a major initiative at the meetings in Britain in 2005. Although the full promise of these meetings was far from met, some significant progress was made. it remains to be seen how the long recession and fiscal crisis in many high-income countries will affect these ratios in the coming years. It is clear that the allocation of foreign aid is only partly determined by the relative needs of developing countries. Much bilateral aid seems to be based largely on political and military consideration. Multilateral aid, example from the World Bank and various UN agencies, is somewhat more economically rational, although here too the rich often seem to attract more resources per capita than the poor, because foreign aid is seen differently by donor and recipient countries. We must analyze the giving and receiving process from these two often contradictory viewpoints. Why donors give aid? First and foremost, donor country governments give aid because it is in their political, strategic, or economical self-interest to do so. Some development assistance may be motivated by moral and humanitarian desires to assist the less fortunate. For example, emergency food relief and medical programs. And certainly, this has been the international rhetoric in the increases in aid in the first decade of the 21st century, which may reflect the fact that ordinary citizens are often more charitable than their leaders. Still, it is doubtful that over longer periods of time, donor nations assist others without expecting some corresponding benefits. Political, economic, military, counterterrorism, anti-narcotics, and etc. in return. We focus here on the foreign aid motivations of donor nations in two broad but often interrelated categories. It is the political and economic. So let's go first to the political motivations. Political motivation is a foreign aid that can be used to accomplish the political aims of a government, allowing it to obtain diplomatic recognition, to gain respect for its role in international institutions, or to improve the accessibility of its diplomats to foreign countries. Political motivations have been by far the more important for aid-granting nations, especially for the largest donor country, the United States. The United States has viewed foreign aid from its beginnings in the late 1940s under the Marshall Plan, which aimed at reconstructing the war-torn economies of Western Europe as a means of containing the international spread of communism. When the balance of Cold War interest shifted from Europe to the developing world in the mid-1950s, the policy of containment embodied in the U.S. aid program dictated a shift in emphasis toward political, economic, and military support for friendly, less developed nations, especially those considered geographically strategic. Most aid programs to developing countries were therefore oriented more toward purchasing their security and propping up their sometimes shaky regimes than promoting long-term social and economic development. Next is the economic motivations. Within the broad context of political and strategic priorities, foreign aid programs of the developed nations have had a strong economic rationale. This is especially true for Japan, which directs most of its aid to neighboring Asian countries, where it has substantial private investments and expanding trade. Even though political motivation may have been of paramount importance for other donors, the economic rationale was at least given lip service the overriding motivation for assistance. Let us examine the principal economic arguments advanced in support of foreign aid. Foreign exchange constraint external finance. Both loans and grants can play a critical role in supplementing domestic resources in order to relieve savings of foreign exchange bottlenecks. This is the so-called two-gap analysis of foreign assistance. The so-called two-gap analysis or two-gap model, a model of foreign aid comparing savings and foreign exchange gaps to determine which is the binding constraint on economic growth. The basic argument of the two-gap model is that most developing countries face either a shortage of domestic savings to match investment opportunities or a shortage of foreign exchange to finance needed imports of capital and intermediate goods. So in two-gap model, there is a savings gap and a foreign exchange gap. The basic two-gap and similar models assume that savings gap or a domestic real resources and the foreign exchange gap are unequal in magnitude and that they are essentially independent. The implication is that one of the two gaps will be binding for any developing economy at a given point in time. Savings gap is the excess of domestic investment opportunities over domestic savings, causing investment to be limited by the available foreign exchange. And foreign exchange gap is the shortfall that results when the planned trade deficit exceeds the value of capital inflows, causing output growth to be limited by the available foreign exchange for capital good imports. Algebraically, the simple two-gap model can be formulated as follows. First is a savings constraint or gap, starting with the identity that capital inflows, or the difference between imports and exports, add to investable resources. The savings investment restriction can be written as I is less than or equal to F plus SY, where F is the amount of capital inflows. If capital inflows F plus domestic saving SY exceeds domestic investment I and the economy is at full capacity, a savings gap is said to exist. Second, the foreign exchange constraint or gap. If investment in a developing country has a marginal import share, M1, typically ranging from 30% to 60%, and the marginal propensity to import out of a unit of non-investment GNI, usually around 10% to 15%, is given by the parameter M2. The foreign exchange constraint or gap can be written as M1 minus M2 times I plus M2Y minus E less than or equal to F, where E is the exogenous level of exports. The term F enters both inequality constraint and becomes the critical factor in the analysis. If F, E, and Y are initially assigned an exogenous current value, only one of the two inequalities will prove binding, that is, investment, and therefore the output growth rate will be constrained to a lower level by one of the inequalities. Countries can therefore be classified according to whether the savings or foreign exchange constraint is binding. More important from the viewpoint of foreign aid analysis is the observation that the impact of increased capital inflows will be greater where the foreign exchange gap rather than the savings gap is binding. Next is the fiscal gap. It is the deficiencies of government investment including infrastructure and human capital that are complementary to raise the rate of return from private investment. Third, fiscal gap may also be important because domestic savings availability for investment and foreign exchange availability for capital goods imports may have little impact on private sector investment and growth without complementary public investment in roads and other forms of infrastructure, or in human capital, but such government investment may raise the rate of return from private investments sufficiently to make them viable. Three gap models have been used to account for this in understanding why growth has commonly failed to pick up during a structural adjustment. The growth in savings. External assistance is also assumed to facilitate and accelerate the process of development by generating additional domestic savings as a result of the higher growth rates that it is presumed to induce. Eventually, it is hoped the need for a concessional aid will disappear as local resources become sufficient to make development self-sustaining. In reality, much aid is not invested, and if it is, the productivity of that investment is often very low. However, among the main reasons for this are the very strings attached to foreign aid. Next is technical assistance. It is a foreign aid, either bilateral or multilateral, that takes the form of the transfer of expert personnel, technicians, scientists, educators, and economic advisors, and particularly their use in training local personnel rather than a simple transfer of funds. Financial assistance needs to be supplemented by technical assistance in the form of high-level worker transfer to ensure that aid funds are used most efficiently to generate economic growth. This skill gap filling process is thus analogous to the financial gap filling process mentioned earlier. Sustainable development impact requires a focus on training in recipient countries. Another is the absorptive capacity. Finally, the amount of aid is considered in relation to the recipient country's absorptive capacity. It is the ability to use aid funds wisely and productively, often meaning as donors want them to be used. Typically, the donor countries decide which developing countries are to receive aid, how much, in what form, loans or grants, financial or technical assistance, for what purpose, and under what condition on the basis of the donor country's assessment of domestic absorptive capacity. Particularly for the least developed countries, But many types of assistance, such as resources for building infrastructure or for training, itself increases absorptive capacity. It has been said that one donor sees as a constraint on the ability of a country to use conventional aid, another sees as an opportunity to have more leverage impact with new forms of assistance. In any case, in practice, the total amount of aid rarely has much to do with developing country absorptive capacity, because typically, foreign aid is a residual and low priority element in the donor country expenditures. In most instances, the recipient countries have little say in the matter. So why recipient countries accept aid? The reasons why developing nations have usually been eager to accept aid, even in its most stringent and restrictive forms, have been given much less attention than the reason why donors provide aid. The major reason is probably economic. Second, in some countries, aid is seen by both donor and recipient as providing greater political leverage to the existing leadership to suppress opposition and maintain itself in power. Finally, whether on grounds of basic humanitarian responsibilities of the rich toward the welfare of the poor or because of a belief that the rich nations owe the poor nations reparation for past exploitations. The role of non-governmental organization in aid. So non-government organization is organization that are often involved in providing financial and technical assistance to developing countries. One of the fastest growing and most significant forces in the field of development assistance is that provided through private non-governmental organizations, or NGOs. NGOs are voluntary organizations that work with and on behalf of mostly local grassroots organizations in developing countries. They also represent specific local and international interest groups with concerns as diverse as providing emergency relief, protecting child health, promoting women's rights, alleviating poverty, protecting the environment, increasing food production, and providing rural credit to small farmers and local businesses. NGOs have two important advantages. First, being less constrained by political imperatives. Most NGOs are able to work much more effectively at the local level with the people they are trying to assist than massive bilateral and multilateral aid programs can. Second, by working directly with local peoples, organizations, many NGOs are better able to avoid the suspicion and cynicism on the part of the mostly poor people whom they serve that their help is insincere or likely to be short-lived. Next is the effects of aid. The issue of the economic effects of aid, especially public aid like that of the effects of private foreign investment, is fraught with disagreement. On one side are the economic traditionalists who argue that aid has indeed promoted growth and structural transformation in many developing countries. On the other side are critics who argue that aid does not promote faster growth but may in fact retard it by substituting for, rather than supplementing, domestic savings and investment, and by exacerbating balance of payments deficits as a result of rising debt repayment obligations. When aid takes the form of loans even at reduced interest rate, and the linking of aid to donor country exports, official aid is further criticized for focusing on and stimulating the growth of the modern sector, thereby increasing the gap in living standards between the rich and the poor in developing countries. Some critics on the left would even assert that foreign aid has been a force for anti-development in the sense that it both retards growth through reduced savings and worsen income inequalities. After years of aid awareness, polls have shown that the public is increasingly willing to support increases in government aid budgets and to donate development assistance via NGOs, and the development crisis in many of the least developed countries, especially in the sub-Saharan Africa, has mobilized public opinion in support of greater development assistance. Poll numbers also suggest that the upturn in public support for aid was at least temporarily weakened in the aftermath of the recent global financial crisis. The attention to improve assistance to reduce extreme poverty, particularly in its increased focus on the 49 least developed countries at the UN 2010 Millennium Development Goals Summit. the improvements in accountability and evaluation of aid that have taken more shape since the Paris Declaration, and some enhancement of resources are hopeful signs that aid will become more effective and more targeted toward people living in poverty. And foreign aid has played a crucial role in assistance with conflict resolution, post-conflict recovery, and making the transition to resume development.